その悲しみを胸に抱いたままでビリ涙よ海へ帰れ恋しくて募る想い空風色に染めてく
Hello and welcome to a mega review and analysis of Universal Century Gundam. In this retrospective of sorts, we'll be going over everything from Mobile Suit Gundam 79 all the way up to F91, with mentions of other things in between. This review will be divided into many parts, and is generally a podcast style thing, as I don't really see much need to put images behind all of it. However, that said, I will be putting the odd image up, so if there's something I say that seems outrageous, feel free to check the screen to see if I provide any sort of visual evidence to go along with my claims. As a Gundam fan, my view, I hope at least, is a little different to a lot of people's in that I am very invested in the franchise at this point, but I also absolutely hate it. I think Zeta Gundam is a brilliant idea that is executed terribly. I think Gundam ZZ suffers massive tonal issues, but is maybe the most true of all the Gundams. And I think F91 is brilliant. So if I haven't turned any of you off yet with that initial piece, the first segment of this review will just be a general, vague introduction to the franchise. There's lots of guides for that sort of thing. It's not too complicated. But if you've never seen a Gundam and you clicked on this, I don't know, by accident, then I'll give a quick rundown of where you can start. Following that is my overview of each of the series. That one's worth watching, even if you've seen them all, as it just gives you my general ideas on everything. And then we get into the meat of it. Chapter titles can be used to skip around segments if you're really not interested in any of them. The one explaining the different timelines in particular is really just for beginners. And yeah, let's get into it. Gundam for beginners. Gundam can seem kind of intimidating to beginners, as even with something like a show and anime of 500, 900 episodes, at least you know, generally speaking, you just press the first episode and get into it. Whereas with Gundam, you're presented with a quadrillion different timelines and series and OVAs and movies. So, keeping it really simple, you essentially have three categories, which are Universal Century Gundams, these starting with the original 79, Alternative Universe Gundams, these being standalone entries, which are by far the easiest to get into and complete, and AUUC, which are technically standalone entries in alternate universes, but that either heavily imply they're in the Universal Century or benefit from having seen it. So let's start with that one first, because it's the most complicated and the one you're least likely to start with. In AUUC, you have a small number of shows, but fairly important ones. First off, you have Turn A Gundam, which is generally recommended to leave till pretty late in your Gundam viewing experience, as it's intended to kind of tie all the timelines, even some of the AU ones, together. So in general, you can kind of just write Turn A off for the time being until you're a bit further down the road. Next, you have Gundam G Reconquista, which is supposedly set thousands of years in the future of the Universal Century timeline, and written by its original writer Yoshiyuki Tomino. G Reconquista is so far into the future that it's essentially standalone, and you can start with it if you so desire. It's very anime in a modern sense of the word, and for some people that does work, though generally it's not the fan favourite. If you fancy it, sure, but probably not my recommendation. Then you have the AUUCs that are truly standalone, but much better if you've seen some things. So first you have Turn A After War X, which is the black sheep in a lot of ways of the 90s anime, but probably the best one too, where essentially it takes the setting of UC Gundam and goes parallel universe, everything went to shit, the apocalypse happened, and now we're doing Mad Max the Gundam edition. It's very good and is standalone, but it feels a lot more satisfying and conclusive if you've seen a lot of UC Gundam and have always wished that it would end. Turn A or After War X kind of gives you that ending. Similarly, you have Gundam Age, which gets panned out of sort of ignorance in an odd sort of way. Our Age came with two stipulations upon its release. One, that it was indeed sort of aimed more at kids, but two, very openly, that it's a homage and a celebration for, I believe, the 35th anniversary of Gundam, of the original trilogy. This raises a problem when people who either haven't seen the original trilogy in years or haven't seen it at all watch Age and don't understand what's happening. Now sure, everyone is free to make the argument that trying to make essentially an 80s anime in the year 2011 was pretty foolish, or at the very least misguided. But if you watch it for what it is, that being a homage to 80s, then you quickly realise it is maybe one of the greatest long-form homages you've ever seen. Really getting the messages and strengths of UC Gundam, respecting the design principles and aesthetics of the original, and a whole lot more. It's a great show, and it can be watched standalone. Like I said, it was made to get kids into New Gundam, but I think it's actually better most of the time if you've seen UC Gundam and you can appreciate what it's getting at. Finally, you have a few others. Gundam Thunderbolt is set in UC, but is technically an alternative timeline. The same with Gundam The Origin. Thunderbolt can be watched on its own. The Origin can be watched on its own. Would I recommend it? It depends what you're into. If you really like jazz, Thunderbolt can be a good way of getting in. And I've heard people like getting into Gundam with The Origin, but I can't see it myself. Alternate universes. Alternate universes are by far the easy mode of Gundam, in that they are all standalone, usually don't even connect to one another, and are usually under 100 episodes, which can again sound intimidating, but a lot more of them are less than 50. The alternate universes come in a wide range, and most of the time you don't need to have seen anything else, like I say. The best examples of this are ones like Gundam Wing, Gundam Seed, and Gundam 00, all of which you can essentially just jump into. Gundam 00 in particular is maybe the best in some regards, as it's the one Gundam that isn't really Gundam, in that while it has loads of visual references and feels like a Gundam, it lacks the original World War II messaging of Nazis, essentially, and imperialist Japanese versus a semi-corrupt American-style federation and, you know, the Allied powers. Whereas 00 has a more terrorist-orientated setup with Cold Wars and Russian influence, Chinese influence, battles over energy and new forms of power, corruption and strife in the Middle East. It's very much so an anime of the 2000s and still, unfortunately, rather relevant today, making it very disconnected thematically from the original too, and a good place to start. Similarly, Iron-Blooded Orphans is very standalone, but at the same time you will love it all the more if you've seen UC. That said, a lot of people start with it, including my younger sister, who then went back and rewatched it after UC, and that way managed to enjoy it a hell of a lot both times. So 00 and IBO would be my recommendations to start. I'd also suggest, if you want to watch it, watch Gundam Seed before you watched all of UC, because Gundam Seed is essentially a modernization of UC, but one that somehow gets it kind of wrong. It does some things right. A lot of the things it does right are things it does original to it. Characters like Mula Flagger and the lieutenant of the stand-in white base, the Archangel, are actually really good, mostly because they're essentially new ideas. It's a show that a lot of women liked in Japan, same with Gundam Wing. If you like Bishi boys and not true but implied boy love, Wing and Seed tend to be quite popular in those regards. Also get the Build series. These are great if you want to inspire yourself to get into the model making or any of that such, or just watch a load of references. You gain more value out of the fun of going, is that such and such a mech? If you've seen, obviously, the more Gundams. So, as such, you can watch them whenever. They're all standalone. Even independent of each other, they're standalone. But the more you've seen, the more rewarding they can be if you're that sort of way inclined. There are other oddballs like UCgundam, which is a sort of super robot show from the early 90s, and ones like that, which generally the fandom wouldn't advise you start with, but you certainly could if you really felt like it. In conclusion, though, what matters about the alternate universe Gundams is if you're really intimidated by this genre, just pick one. Pick whichever one you've heard the most about or your friend liked, and just go for it. Because at the end of the day, even if you pick wrong and you start with, I don't know, Gundam Unicorn, the fact is you can always backtrack, and a reference to something that already happened, but you see the reference before the original, it simply inverts it so that when you watch the original, it feels like a reference to the reference. Confusing, but actually pretty simple once you get into it. Talking about Gundam and how to start with it is often the most confusing bit of Gundam. Finally, we have Universal Century, the first, by far the longest, by far the most convoluted, confusing, and just messy. My entire retrospective is about UC, mostly early UC with a few mentions of the later stuff. The following segment is my overview of the entire thing that this retrospective will be covering, so I'll let it take the wheel. If you're interested in starting UC, you can listen to these overviews. They're all spoiler-free, and hopefully they'll give you some idea of what you want to watch. Thanks for listening if this is where you jump off, and I hope you enjoy watching Gundam. Let's get into it. Part 1. General Overview. As a part of anime, Gundam is one of the most integral pieces. Spanning more than 40 years with numerous games, manga, and our primary query of anime, this behemoth franchise continues to affect the landscape to this day, whether it be the original 79 essentially creating an entire genre of anime, and one of the most iconic ones to Japan at that, leading the way into the 90s for the final OVA boom, or often being seen as the true paragon of the classic mecha genre, with the likes of Unicorn and Iron-Blooded Orphans keeping the torch alive today. Gundam is most certainly an important piece of any anime fan trying to understand and get the most out of this medium. With all that in mind, today's review is going to be a little different, in that I'd like to discuss my thoughts on UCgundam, the original timeline, all the way up to and including Mobile Suit Gundam F91. To start, I'll be going over my briefest of feelings on each of the series I watched as a part of this, many of which I'd already watched, but some of which I've since rewatched once, if not twice more. Feel free to just read the segments, or listen in this case, that you're interested in. I'll keep major spoilers for other series out of each, e.g. if I'm talking about ZZ, there'll be no spoilers for it in the Zeta section. Furthermore, I'll try to keep spoilers out of this initial overview, so feel free to use this as a vague overview of my thoughts on whether to watch any of the listed series, etc., etc. At which point we'll be more broadly discussing my general problems with UC as a meta-narrative and in-universe concept, along with the reasons I believe I always get dragged back in anyway, with adequate spoiler tags where required. If you have come here off the back of one of my standalone Gundam reviews, then thank you very much, and please enjoy. Mobile Suit Gundam 79, a 9 to a 10 out of 10. The original MSG is still a contender for my favourite, and not for nostalgic reasons. As we will go into further details as we progress, much of my greater issues with the many subsequent series are the weight and burden that is placed upon them. 79's story is relatively simple to follow. Everything is new, everything gets a date and a big operation name, the settings are by default all fresh, the suits designed cleverly, the political machinations believable, and both sides are corrupt and just to varying degrees of merit. Even as someone who didn't start with 79 as my first mech or even Gundam show, it still felt revolutionary to me. There are a few other instances where I at least perceive as Tomino's original vision shines true more strongly. The anti-war sentiment, the ideas of good-intentioned people on both sides, the damage to the planet we all call home, and most, maybe prevalently, this strong-seated urge that his writing often glows with, that desperately wants the world to come to an understanding. A world where no one fights or dies pointlessly, but instead we just talk and make an effort to understand one another. It's something I don't think was properly captured again to this extent, and I'm about to lose some of you, until Gundam F91 came along. As for production quality, while it's certainly of its time, it's nowhere near as bad as some decree most of the time. Yes, there's some goofy stills that's of little consequence, and generally those are pretty fun to laugh at anyway. The OST is strong, the directing very memorable, and the animation serviceable. It's the one place where maybe the show loses a point. Many will advise you watch only the recap films, and while I understand their thought, to me they cut away a little too much, make the new types feel like a prophesized messiah, and can generally feel a bit jarring. With that said, the visuals of the recaps are unquestionably better, and the OST gets an amazing boost. In an ideal world, we'd have an Evangelion situation, where Sunrise released the director's cut of the original, but with the new animation and music insert songs. All told, the third film is most certainly worth watching, while the first two are wholly skippable and certainly don't usurp the original for anyone even vaguely interested in fully experiencing Gundam 79. But Encounters in Space, Film 3, on the other hand, is original MSG as its best and a major peak for the franchise as a whole. Mobile Suit Gundam The 8MS Team, 8.5 out of 10. The 8MS Team is one of a lot of people's flaunt as the best or most grounded Gundam series. Now let's be frank, neither of those claims are true. While I completely understand why people love this one as their favourite, 0080 and 0083 are far more grounded warfare stories, and arguably both are better than 8MS Team in some regards. With that said, this is by no means to say the 8 is a bad show. It's damn great. Shiro's hopeful optimism is infection, his and 9 is romances, a cliched classic executed beautifully, and the production values are to die for. The story is heavily weakened by the possibly unmatched, in Universal Century, levels of plot armor, contrivance, and coincidence, but as a slice of the ground combat and a different take on the anti-war story, 8MS Team is a beloved member of the canon for good reason. Norris is fecking awesome, and this is a good place to start if you're trying to get into UC. MS Igloo, a 7 to an 8.5 out of 10. Igloo is marred as a black sheep of the UC canon, in particular its first 2 seasons, and some may be surprised to see me even give it a full section of its own, but to me, Igloo actually succeeds surprisingly well. As an exploration of various unseen and unheard battles of the Federation and Zeon, battles without any Gundams or new types, gritty, brutal, and often fatal, Igloo triumphs. I get why people dislike its formulaic nature, and I'd agree the CGI could be improved on. Not to the extent some think the combat can be pretty cool. However, I do shown its individual goals, and as both an oddity for consumption in a museum, and as an exploration of the men and women whose lives suddenly became obsolete artifacts, which is a nice beat of meta writing in itself when you consider it was being shown in a museum. With the inception of the mobile suit, so very brilliantly displayed in episode 1, the show does this to a T. It's not for everyone, and we'll discuss some of the bizarre issues people have drawn retaining to its depictions of Zeon later, but overall Igloo isn't all that bad. It's just a little misunderstood. Mobile Suit Gundam Thunderbolt, 7.5 out of 10 for Season 1, 5.5 to 6 for Season 2. Thunderbolt is a fascinating entry in this franchise. The first part is often flaunted as a jazz-addled, visceral one-off battle in some far-off corner of the universe, which, conversely, is a downright lie. It's more like tree battles with some terrible pacing in between. The part about the jazz being great is true, though. Meanwhile, everyone seems to want to forget the second part even exists, and I can see why. Season 1 would be infinitely stronger if it was just a single battle. Its efforts to be a more dramatic narrative with gaps in between each engagement and some rather forced character building. The "do you have a tissue" line, for example, is the most opaque character dynamic building dialogue in the franchise, and that's really saying something for this franchise. It buzzes with potential, some of which it pulls off, but most of which is just too much. It pains me that we get 4 measly, under 20 minutes an episodes to cover disabled soldiers and Federation-siding space knights, 2 topics that are ripe for the examining in this continuity. Ultimately, Season 1 can come across as all style and no substance, but boy is that style something. The score, the visuals, the momentum of each battle, the new suit designs, it's all superb even if it did take a short lifetime to come out. Probably the consistently most breathtaking of the digitally rendered Gundams. Season 2 is a near indefensible disaster. Sure, there's some neat ideas about religious fanaticism, but again, that's a lot to do in 4 parts, and I'm not even sure really they gave it all that much effort. Furthermore, the new Gundam's existence doesn't really track well on the whole timescale, and it just adds more Neo-Zeon remnants to the massive pile of Zeon vagabonds that already exists at the time of the show's conception. Wibbledy-wobbledy timelines be damned. The plot actively weakens the previous series, and while the production values are still high, they lose some of their weight in this jumbled mess of even more underserviced, rife ideas. One of UC's biggest disappointments. Mobile Suit Gundam 0080 War in the Pocket, 10 out of 10. I put off 0080 for a long time because of its reputation for being a romance of pilots on opposite sides, from the eyes of a child. Well, this is sort of true. Don't let it deter you the way it did me from watching this glorious entry. We'll be talking about it in full throughout the course of this essay, so it may help to have seen it going forwards. With that said, it operates like any other Gundam, initially at least, so don't be put off by its description, because what War in the Pocket is the purest form of Gundam that there is. It's the most confident in its anti-war message, the most powerfully affecting in its brilliantly fleshed out characters, the best paced of any Gundam I've watched, and produced wonderfully. Put simply, 0080 is the best Gundam. If you're interested in my broader thoughts, I have a review of it, so feel free to check that out. Overall, War in the Pocket is the best UC series to date on arguably all fronts, and is a must-watch. Gundam 0083, Stardust Memory, a 7 to an 8.5 out of 10. Like Igloo, though far less justifiably, 0080 is often slated as one of the weaker UC shows by those who let their dismay at the ending ruin the experience of the whole show. That ending is, to be fair, without doubt, one of the worst in Gundam history. Not just because of the route they take the love triangle, or the way Annabelle and Co are written, but rather because of the promises it doesn't fill. And no, I don't just mean that it doesn't end with a stupid robot fight. Stardust has all the opportunity to be everything Zeta Gundam fails to be and then some, which for a time it succeeds in superbly. It actively makes Zeta look even weaker than it already is, all while filling in some of its plot contrivances. However, the last-minute reintroduction of the Titans, the ludicrous epilogue simply ruins the property, and ends up leaving a bitter taste in your mouth. That said, this is still one of the all-time strongest entries into the mecha genre there is, a show where machines actually have technical faults, where the ranks matter and beliefs of the enemy is vivid and enthralling. Part of me thinks if Annabelle Gatto told me to kamikaze into a battle on the double, I'd go without hesitation. That's just how friggin' brilliantly written a character and charismatic an individual he is. He's got very little competition in terms of Gundam's best rival ace character. I'd even argue his case against Char if he just had a better ending. To conclude, while it goes off the deep end in its final arc to mixed effect, Stardust awe-striking production values, including the best in Gundam openings like The Winner, more than makes up for its failures, and while it could be a masterpiece, it certainly succeeds brilliantly for most of its run, that being episodes 3 and 7, which are peak Gundam, and as a welcome substitute to a certain arch rival of mine. I'll suit Zeta Gundam, a 5 to a 6.5 out of 10. I really love the Sign of Zeta song. It doesn't fit the tone whatsoever, it's morbidly of its time in a horribly outdated way, and it doesn't hold a candle to the 90s Gundam OPs, but damn, Sign of Zeta is a bop. I've written at length about my feelings on Zeta. It's to me the very worst of Tomino and the team's bad writing habits. It fails to properly uphold the themes of the original, is deeply affected in a negative way by Tomino's real-life mental state at the time, and continues to shill out to the toy sponsors far more than even the original, with more nonsensical suit designs introduced seemingly on a random weekly basis, with little to no in-universe explanation or world-building of the original. It doesn't even try to give them good reasons to be there. Its villains are almost all contenders for the most black and white and least nuanced of the franchise. Its fights are repetitive and without much strategy. It is an example of some of the most inexplicable new type wizardry of the whole saga, and is generally 20 to 30 episodes of filler. MX2. With all that said, there is still some good in Zeta when looked at as a whole. The animation is well above average for the time, and the direction is pretty great, with some awesome visuals and compositions in the likes of episode 12, good measure. The OST is objectively one of the best of the 80s, and Gundam in general. There are interesting threads of story and characters, and those who like interpretation that requires excessively deep diving may get a lot out of this. Nonetheless, I'm steadfast in my belief of Zeta's mistransgressions, and it will be an important talking point going forward. All that said, the original is still endlessly better than the 2004 remakes. Suit Gundam ZZ, a 7 to a 9 out of 10. While initially providing a degree of tonal whiplash, Tomino's improving mental state and comments from the studio and his wife quickly helped to steer Gundam, temporarily, back on course. The show returns to its roots. Grunt pilots are once more treated as people whose deaths hold consequences. Funerals make a much-needed return, comical at times or not. The destruction of the Earth is infinitely more apparent in a shown rather than told fashion. The conflict, far more interestingly, with properly detailed and far better, or at all for that matter, motivated villains. The cast are fun and not killed off at random for no reason. Captain Bright is used properly. El Peru, fuck you Unicorn, at least get her name right, becomes the progenitor of a whole anime archetype, and the series' conclusion is far more satisfying and thematically conclusive than anything that has come since. ZZ is, put lightly, the true sequel to Gundam 79, and the better overarching ending to the saga. It is truly a shame people can't look past the 8 subpar initial episodes in order to realise what they're missing out on. So while the story has many flaws, the conflict is sometimes comically small in terms of the number of ships present at big battles, and the tone is overall lighter. The production is on a par with Zeta's for unsurprising reasons. Silent Voice is easily the best and most appropriate of the 4 OPs between the two shows, and much of the rest of the OST is straight from Zeta, which is an automatic win. The characters are stronger, the team's more resonant, and the presentation less backstabby to the audience. ZZ is a must-watch before going to Counterattack, and especially before Unicorn, and I won't accept otherwise. Mobile Suit Gundam Char's Counterattack, a 4 to a 6 out of 10. I'll keep this brief as we'll be talking a lot about this as we go forward into the essay. But Char's Counterattack is without doubt the least satisfying cop-out of an ending possible. It forgoes upwards of 100 episodes to it, bar a throwaway line, retreads already covered ground, retcons established character progression, puts the world in an awkward position, and is just a mess of part fan service and part character analysis. Now, to be fair, the analysis of Char and the political systems of Gundam could be great if Zeta didn't exist. Now, to be clear, this isn't to suggest I hate Char in CCA, because I don't. He could have gone from Quattro to this. No, while handled exceedingly poorly and lazily, I can totally see that progression. Heck, it could even be an interesting one, but you cannot go from Quattro and Amuro being best friends forever, straight back to rivalry mode. Looking at a shot glass does not solve this problem. Further, why would you skip another decade? Why does Bright look younger? Even time itself seems to fear getting slapped by Captain Bright Noah. And you can't just say that Axis rebuilt itself from a pile of rubble and blended ashes because the public hid them from our inspections. You what? All those battleships and mobile suits? Hid them where the sun don't shine? What sort of half-assed explanation is that for the building up of an entire armada of ships bigger than Neo-Zeon originally were? I can see how I may come off as facetious on this one, so let me also be blunt in saying that the production values are still great, no better than F91s or 0080s only a couple of years later, mind you. Beyond That Time is misused, but a great tune along with the rest of a stellar OST. The suit designs are memorable, the animation is good, and there's always something going on. It's truly a shame that CCA is just kind of pointless and infuriating. Mobile Suit Gundam Unicorn, a 7.5 to an 8.5 out of 10. In similar fashion to how 0083 is the true Zeta, Unicorn is the actual sequel to both CCA and ZZ. It attempts valiantly to uphold all of Gundam's various messages and themes, all while desperately trying to give the timeline some semblance of closure, which it so desperately needs. If Unicorn's individual parts were listed on Mal, I would quite likely give parts 3 to 6 a 10 out of 10. However, whether it's the numbing, clunky dialogue of the first two parts, with their mystery box story gimmick and forced drama, or the especially admirable failure that is the last feature-length part, Unicorn ultimately fails under the weight of its burdens. In something I'd consider calling the curse of F91, Unicorn not only has to fill the unfulfilled promises of Zeta and ZZ, that which CCA simply left hanging in the air, but also the unenviable task of trying to bridge the gap between CCA and 91. It's just too much. Add to that a bizarre MacGuffin, I guess what was inside the box in episode 1, that doesn't make me feel smug, it makes me feel sad, and a whole cast of new characters to deal with. Ultimately, it just can't do it all. So despite how I greatly respect the hustle, and while it felt so good to be there with you all during episodes 3 to 6, to feel the hype everyone places around things like Zeta and CCA, to think I might actually succeed, ultimately, the beast of potential was little more than a myth. Sure does look and sound good, though. Mobile Suit Gundam Narrative, a 4 to a 6 out of 10. Narrative Gundam, well, it exists. I don't really get what narrative is for. It isn't the sequel Unicorn's ending so desperately needs, but it also isn't a standalone piece or the start of a new chapter. It's meh. It actively weakens some of the elements from Unicorn, and while it looks good in its own right, Unicorn's stylistic choices make it more endearing. By the end, the story dissolves into needless fan service, and it really forms into a sort of weird, hyper-condensed rehash of what came before. It's bizarre, not really worth your time, and even less cohesive an ending than what came before it. Mobile Suit Gundam Hathaway's Flash. Hathaway's Flash wasn't out, I don't think, or I hadn't watched it when I wrote this review, so off the script for a minute. Hathaway's Flash is a really good movie, not a very good Gundam. I mean that, and there's a lot of great reviews. For some reason, Netflix didn't optimize it. So if you watch it at home on your computer or your TV and you're anything like me, you end up with a situation where you can't see the mobile suit battles even if you turn your brightness up to maximum, which is fun. You still get some really striking imagery and like explosions coming out of the dark, but I couldn't tell you what Hathaway's mobile suit looks like. Aside from the mechs, because they really aren't the focus, as a movie, it's interesting. It's kind of like James Bond Gundam Edition for half an hour, and then a lot of talking for an hour. It's not a bad movie. It's not really a giant robot movie, and that can be a hurdle to overcome for most. I'm interested to see where it goes, and I fear for Captain Bright knows I'd give it somewhere around a 7 to a 9 out of 10. Mobile Suit Gundam F91, a 7.5 to an 8.5 out of 10. I make an important distinction between favourites and the best. The best UC Gundam is, in my opinion, either 79 or War in the Pocket. But my favourite, that's Gundam F91. It's riddled with issues and a massive amount of short-sightedness on Tomino's part, something which is sort of getting used to at this point. It should be a reboot, but it clearly isn't. Even if it had been a TV show, it's just too close to the previous events. Although it can be watched standalone as a litmus test to see if Gundam UC is for you. Its pacing is that of a roller coaster, but with all that said, it's still friggin' brilliant. The animation quality is the peak of Gundam. The OST, including the flagrant stealing of Star Wars tracks, is astounding. Eternal Wind is the second best Gundam OP. It fits so much better with the story's themes than, say, for example, Beyond Our Time does. And it's so much better made use of that it's such a great song, it's almost timeless. When I listen to Zeta and ZZ's OPs, they're great, but clearly dated. Eternal Wind actively outperforms things that have come since. But maybe, most interestingly is, I believe, quite possibly by coincidence, that F91 better captures the point of Gundam 79 than anything in between did. New types return to their roots of just being a type of commutative power that binds us all, and cyber new types are done proper justice when we finally get a true idea of what they are, not just horribly tortured or mentally unstable. No, when new types are weapons out of chance, cyber new types are weapons by design. This is present in the others, but I think it's most clear here and in ZZ. The directing is amazing, adds that a great dub, and the fact it's the only mainline Gundam that doesn't have a Gundam. No, really, the F91 isn't a Gundam. It isn't. Lol. This is some of the most pure and oddly engaging Gundam to date. Just a shame it frags up the timeline so much, but we'll get to that. And before anyone asks, yes, I do have Gunpla, and yes, my first one was a Master Grade F91 version 2. God help me and have mercy. Mobile Suit Gundam The Origin, or The Advent of the Red Comet, 7 out of 10. Like I said at the start, this kind of goes in the AUUC with Thunderbolt, but we're counting it in here because it is still UC. It's an odd placement, but then again, The Origin sits in an odd place. Based on flashbacks of a much more expansive manga, The Origin is generally categorized as a separate timeline, which is good because it makes no fucking sense when joined to the main timeline. Not that the fact it's a separated continuity is made clear at any point, meaning for casual fans they'll most likely be completely unaware of this, which is a flaw in its own right. We will be using Origin to discuss a few things, but I wouldn't consider it required viewing, considering it's hard to spoil something we already know all the events of. Although The Origin is fine. Visually, it's a downgrade from Unicorn or Iron-Blooded Orphans. As well, it can sometimes look great, and many of the stills are lovely. The CGI is far more apparent than Unicorns, and the action far less dynamic than the aforementioned IBO. Generally speaking, it's just underwhelming. While it sometimes gets things right, often it plays up some of the franchise's worst traits. We soon talk about how it gets parts of Ron Barrow's character completely wrong, overplays Doza's betrayal to the point where the genuinely good writing for him is wasted on focusing in on his goofy side, and how Sharon Garma's character's displays just make them even more confusing as characters than they already were. You may enjoy Origin, and good for you. I do too sometimes. But overall it's just a little off. I think it's time to go deeper into all of this discussion. Other Gundams I've seen and required viewing that the rest of the essay will discuss. Aside from the UC Gundam, it may be helpful to just mention the other properties I've spent time with in order to give a better picture of my feelings on the entire franchise. The following is that list. 00, 10 out of 10 for Season 1, 7.5 to 8.5 for Season 2, 3 to 4 out of 10 for the follow-up movies. Gundam Seed, 7 out of 10, Gundam Seed Destiny, 4.5 out of 10. Gundam Iron-Blooded Orphans, 8.5 to 9 out of 10 for Season 1, 10 out of 10 for Season 2. After War Gundam X, a 9 to a 10 out of 10. Gundam Build Fighters Original, 10 out of 10. Gundam Build Fighters Try, 6 out of 10. Gundam Build Divers, 9 to 10 out of 10. Dropped Gundams. Gundam Wing, didn't see it as a kid, just couldn't get into it as an adult. G-Reconquista, seen the first recap, didn't hate it, but wasn't much grabbed either. Additionals that I've watched since this, Gundam Age, 9 out of 10. As for what we will be discussing going forwards, this was by far my longest preamble. I'll be posting spoiler tags for the biggest spoilers, but generally speaking, I'll be speaking pretty freely on Mobile Suit Gundam 79, Mobile Suit Gundam Zeta, ZZ, CCA, Shots Counterattack, Unicorn, and War in the Pocket, essentially the main core of series, with lesser spoilers, which should be marked as such, for the Origin, F91, Stardust Memory, and small bits of Igloo. I don't intend to address Thunderbolt or the 8MS team all that much, as they're either encompassed in the discussion as is, or simply not relevant. Thunderbolt in general is a bit too short to be all that important, and the 8MS team could almost do with an essay of its own, but mostly fits into what I'm going to say in relation to other shows anyway, so they aren't required to keep up. I thank you greatly if you made it through this massive fucking preamble, and I hope the overview either gives you something to watch if you're new, or at least gives across my general opinion. If this is all way too much for you to listen to the whole thing, then I hope the overview gave you a general idea of my opinions on the shows and maybe made you think more about your own opinions on them. I hope you enjoyed, and maybe some people are still here and will come back for part 2. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.